Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Good.
Is the summer treating you well?
Yeah, we have had a gorgeous summer in Victoria. I feel a little bad for the rest of the country because I know there's been pretty sweltering in Ontario and through the U.S., but we've missed it here. It's been one of the nicest summers, so no complaints. The spring wasn't very good, so maybe we're making up for it.
But you've got fires, I thought, happening.
Not so much. Well, certainly not on the island that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I haven't heard too much bad in BC.
Right. Are you getting away much?
A little bit, little trips here and there,
Okay.
which has been great. Yeah.
Calgary.
How about you?
Well, yeah, we just came back from camping. Brutally hot, and we're going to be in your part of the country next week, as you already know. So it'll be great to connect with you and yours.
Yeah, looking forward to it. The heat was bad camping, eh? You can't escape it when you camp. That's the thing about heat when you're camping.
I know.
There's no respite, right?
You sleep like a starfish.
Yeah.
Everything's extended.
Yeah.
Well, it's the new normal. Okay, enough of the vacation talk. We should get to business here. This is going to be a potpourri kind of an episode. We're going to do a little bit of this and that. I've got three main points. I don't know about you, Scott, but I want to talk first about what the next few months hold for this podcast. The second thing I want to talk about is, did we achieve our goals in this season? And then I do want to tie the loop on that Ancient Hominid miniseries that we started. We didn't finish it. I'll explain what I mean by that. So let's start with this slowing down. We've typically gone on hiatus at this time of year during, August, July, August. That's typical for us. I think 5 of the 6 seasons that we put out, we always seem to end in the summer months. And that's because of my teaching schedule and some vacations and other personal distractions. There will be a trickle of episodes. We've got 2 that we know are still going to come out in the next few weeks. And as time goes on, there may be others, things happen in the news or a really good book comes out. But otherwise, we're going to be quiet until basically the end of January. Does that work with you, Scott?
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem.
So time for the grade report. Did we achieve our goals? When we started this season in January, we said we had an agenda, a goal for this 6th season. We said we didn't want to just debunk or deconstruct. We wanted to do more reconstruction and rebuilding and giving our listeners something to help move them forward through their own faith systems rather than only give them reasons to give up entirely. So I'm going to ask you now, Scott, I haven't prepared you for this. Do you think we met our goals?
Partially. It's frankly more challenging to reconstruct than deconstruct. I'm very good at tearing things apart at the house here. I'm not very good at putting them back together. That's when the tradespeople come in. I try, but so I think it is challenging, and I think we've done some, and we've done some in the past too. But it's an ongoing process. It's not something that maybe I had a higher expectation, or I thought, we won't finish this. I don't think you don't finish something like this. It's just you take more steps in the journey forward, right? And I think we did take some steps, but there's plenty more. And I think talking to people like Doug Otati, for example, was very helpful. And in that particular area, So I think I would give us I don't know, from my perspective, I guess maybe like a B+.
Okay. Very good.
I don't know about you.
You said it's harder to rebuild. And do you think that's partly because basically other people who say, you can't believe that, you can't say that, they may refer to some theologian, Calvin said such and such. Is that what makes it harder? Because I find sometimes I want to entertain ideas that theologians have dismissed because they've built up a system, an artifice, a man-made object. And when you now propose something that doesn't fit into the system, they say, nope, that's heresy.
Right. Yeah, that's outside the bounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of it, for sure. And I think that can apply on both sides of the, quote, theological aisle, on the conservative side, but maybe on the liberal side, too.
Right.
Yeah, so you are kind of plowing your own road to a certain extent. And if you look back historically at the great reformers or people who, it's a lonely path. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Even, you think of somebody like Luther, it bothered him a lot that the whole church seemed to be against him. And it bothered him a lot to think, could I really be right? And these guys have been wrong for 1,500 years of
Right.
theology. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like, how arrogant can you be to think, I've got a better way?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, rightly so. It shouldn't be taken lightly. When you question some of these things, I think you should have respect for the past and respect for what other great thinkers have thought and said. So, yeah, it's a humbling kind of project.
As long as there's some flexibility, because the fact is that there's so many questions that can't easily be answered by theology the way we have it right now. And so, for example, the problem of theodicy, evil in the world, people would say, how can there be a God if he knows all things and he is all powerful and he's all good? And, that typical trilemma. So people have stumbled over that. But now we
Yep.
have this new idea, open and process theology, which partly challenges the whole idea, did God always know? Does he know everything? Or is he constrained by our responses, for example?
Right.
And that's just one example of many, right?
Well, that's a good example because you're kind of hitting there too on the first thing you talked about, that something like theodicy, if your solution is to say, okay, we need to rethink traditional theology's ideas of omniscience and omnipotence and so on, then yeah, I guess conservatives, whatever you want to say, are going to balk at that. They're going to say, well, you're changing fundamental things. You're accommodating God now to your ideas, right?
Right.
I think you have to take that quite seriously, but they also have to be encouraged to rethink their assumptions,
Right.
just because, right?
Yeah.
Just because something's been taught, and also counter examples. So there's lots of things throughout the biblical literature to indicate that God is this all-powerful being, but there's also a lot of things where God's talking about regretting making man, and he seems to be quite genuinely surprised at things that we do and so on. That has to be accounted for,
Yeah,
right? So
exactly. Okay, so you only gave us a B plus. I think we did better than that myself.
okay.
We started off with 4 or 5 episodes about, well, we explained the approaches that you and I took, the tools that we used to critique our belief systems. We were giving our listeners the tools that we ourselves used, things like
Right.
the Wesleyan quadrilateral and running that ramp of reason before making the leap of faith. And we both described, after having done that, we both described where we'd landed.
Right.
Still, I think, within the camp of Christianity, as far as I'm concerned, we may be outside the fencing around traditional Christianity, or orthodoxy, as Roger Olson put it several times, repeatedly. And our episodes talking to John Kirkwood and Peter Enns and Brian McLaren specifically about how they also completely deconstructed the faith systems that were handed to them when they were kids, and they rebuilt something new. All of these would give our listeners examples and strategies, the ways and the means to substitute components of a Christian belief that just won't work and replace them with components that do. That's what I find for myself.
Okay.
Although, again, those substitutions will be unacceptable to people like Roger Olson, but I learned to live with that. That was really one of the themes in our first few episodes. I learned to accept the fact that people like Roger are going to say, you're not Orthodox anymore. And I say, well, I have a faith system that works.
Yeah. Well, and maybe the response to that is, yeah, I'm not Orthodox. But to me, that's not as devastating as, to some they would say, well, if you're not Orthodox, you're not a Christian. And those are people who really think that Christianity's focus is about thinking right things,
Right.
as opposed to following Jesus Christ, and
Orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy, right? And those things can be different, right?
Yeah.
And so you got lots of Christians in the U.S. right now who supposedly think the right things and are doing horrible things
Yeah.
in the name of Christ, and
Yeah.
and even through their silence, I'm just disgusted by the situation in Gaza, and I don't care where you are on the spectrum of politics and what you believe about Israel, Palestine, all that kind. Forget all that. From a Christian perspective, you have to say it's horrible.
Right.
People are dying, children are starving, and we have to be against that,
Right.
And yet so many supposed Christians who believe the right things are not, and it just strikes me when you read the Gospels how often Jesus runs into this, where the orthodoxy's there, the Pharisees and all they're getting, but the orthopraxy's not, and And which side of things does he fall on? It's always the orthopraxy, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
He's always concerned about that, not whether you're obeying the Sabbath in the right way. Yeah.
So another example of our original goal of replacing outdated ideas with newer ones was that mini-series we did looking at ancient hominids and how those discoveries should cause us to rethink a lot of our Christian ideas. Again, not to simply discard a Christian belief system entirely simply because, in this case, it doesn't, the whole young earth mentality doesn't add up anymore. It's just so out of touch with reality. But instead, my goal was to replace some of those outdated ideas with new ones, revisions to our Christian theology. And we did a lot of that with Doug Otati, as you mentioned, Scott. But the truth be told, I pulled the ejection seat handle a bit early on that miniseries. I had been intending to take it a few steps further, doing a few more episodes, but I was getting the sense from some of the feedback and comments from listeners that these episodes weren't quite holding people's attention. That whole issue of paleontologists finding ancient prehistoric bones just wasn't scratching their itch. So here's where I was intending to go with this. In a nutshell, I want to do a little thought exercise here. I want the listener to imagine a piece of paper, a blank 8x11 sheet, and rotate it with the 11 inches going left to right. So landscape mode. And imagine starting your pen in the middle of that page and start to draw a line from the center going to the right-hand side. That line represents our timeline of understanding, the traditional Judeo-Christian understanding of God, that understanding evolving over the past 4,000 years, starting in the center of the page from when biblical texts began to be written until, on the right-hand side, today. We don't need to put specific numbers on the timeline. I know that young earth creationists might want to give it 6,000 years, but the rest of us will want to use numbers with 6 or 7 digits. It really doesn't change the point I'm trying to make here. On that line that you've just drawn, about 1/3 of the way out from the center, put a mark, a line, an X or something. That indicates when believers would say that God intervened in our history, when we came to an understanding of God, our relationship with God even. So this mark would be the time of Adam, in air quotes, or Abraham, David, if you will, or ancient Jewish religious leaders during the writing and editing of the Jewish scriptures. And at the far right-hand side of that line, at the end of that line, put an asterisk, not on the end, but right at the end, to represent our understanding of God,
Right.
how we understood him, or the idea of God that we were moving towards. So those ancient Jews started at the center of our 8x11 page with no understanding of God, of Yahweh, and moved to the far right side to where we now are with this asterisk representing their or our current understanding of God. Now, it wasn't just the Jews who were coming to an understanding of God. We need to put in a couple branches here. Throw in a branch to the one side for Orthodox Christianity, which split away from Judaism, and then another split from that to represent Catholicism, and then another split from that to represent Protestantism. And make those lines go to the right-hand side as well, and put asterisks there as well, but make these asterisks a little bit different. One might be missing one of the arms of the asterisk. One might have a bigger arm than the other arms on that asterisk, because each of those see God in different ways. And each of those will insist that they have the true understanding of God. And now we need to remember that it wasn't just the Jews and Christians who are seeking to find an understanding of God. We've got Buddhists and Muslims as well. So you can draw a couple lines. You can start them where you want on that page and stretch them out to the right-hand side. Give them, at the end of their lines, give them a square or a triangle or a circle, because they're trying to come to an understanding of God, but it looks very different than the Christian one and the Jewish one. So all of these are different timelines of understanding of God, and all coming to a different picture. Now, we don't have to take this to the next step, but I'll just mention it. You'll get the idea. It wasn't just the Jews and the Christians and the Buddhists and the Muslims. We've also got the Zoroastrian faith, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, Romans, the Greeks, Assyrians, the Philistines, the Ethiopians. I could go on for many minutes. And that's in the past. We can also talk about people that we know about today. The Australian Aboriginals, African tribal people, the Northern and North American indigenous peoples, the Mayans, the Aztecs. There's so many groups of people who have a timeline stretching out to the right-hand side of that page with a different symbol at the end of their line, a very different image of God. And while we're there, let's go back to the Protestant branch and start adding a lot of twigs on that, because we all know the one thing that's notable about Protestantism is how it just constantly splits into different denominations and then sub-denominations. Scott, is there a word for these splits?
The mutations.
Schisms, I think, is the word that came to my mind when I asked it.
Yeah, schisms, sects.
Yeah. So hundreds of different lines, all of humans trying to understand God and coming to a different idea of what God looks like and how he acts like, what he wants. And this then brings me to the point that I wanted to do in the episode, the miniseries. The ancient hominids, we have evidence, scientists have evidence that they too appear to have been on a spiritual journey. We have evidence that they had a sense of the afterlife. They had a sense of deities because they made little statuettes. And we talked about the big brains of Neanderthals, but the even much bigger brains of the Homo julioensis, and of course the Denisovans. So they seem to also have been on this spiritual journey trying to find out who God is. We don't know how far they came along on their timelines. We don't know if it was anything like what we, Christians or Jews or Babylonians or Australian indigenous people, we all had different ideas of what God looked like. And then my last point, we also have evidence that animals living today, some species of animals, it looks like they also might be on some kind of a spiritual quest. Doug Otadi was one who mentioned, and I'm forgetting who the other person was that mentioned elephants seem to have something, they do something that biologists just say there's something similar here to a religious practice of some kind. And I've heard in the past of chimps also. I forget the details, but basically they were throwing rocks at a tree and building a little shrine or something like that. So the chimps also, the anthropologists studying this group of chimps also came to the conclusion there's something religious to this activity. This is the point that I wanted to make. The writers of the Bible did not have this perspective of all these species all trying to understand God in their own way. The writers of the Bible only knew about a few humans over the past 4,000 years from the beginning of the writings of the Jewish scriptures. But we now have a 21st century perspective that they did not have. We see that humans throughout recorded human history in every part of the globe, every socioeconomic and racial slice of the demographic pie, all ages, all levels of wisdom and technological achievement, every kind of human ever has had this tendency to be religious and spiritually minded. And we see this tendency for spiritualism and religiosity in other species on Earth, and maybe, why not, species on other planets, other parts of the universe. All of these on a path, a journey of trying to find a greater meaning, a greater plane of existence, a greater being. Call that God. And all of these species are confident that they, maybe even they alone, are on the right path. Many of them may admit that they're not yet at the end point of being fully divinely minded. I certainly think that evangelicals believe they're closest to that end point. And Buddhism has the idea that individuals today can achieve a fully enlightened, even divine status. But I think this new perspective that we now have in the 21st century, a perspective that none of the biblical authors and thinkers had, this new awareness requires that anyone who spends time exploring theology or religions, religiousness, spiritual inclinations, they have to be a lot more open-minded about who or what God is and how we relate to him, her, it, however you want to, whatever pronoun you want to use. And we need to be really humble in claiming to have the truest understanding of God. That's where I wanted that miniseries to end. Scott.
Well, I mean, you said a lot, and a lot could be discussed there, which is not really the purpose of this episode, but just a couple comments that I think that's even in keeping with the thrust of the kind of biblical narrative. That, the biblical narrative is an unfolding of a people, a history of a people and their struggle with God. I mean, Israel means fights with God. I mean, that's what their name is. And the history that we see unfolding in the Bible is a mixed bag of a people who struggles, who do some great things, and do some horrible things, and always developing their understanding of their God, right? And it even talks in several places in there, and in the New Testament too. Paul mentions it that there is a natural theology, there's a natural wonder of, when you look at the world, that it seems there's something bigger than us. There's something, that's a natural inclination. And so I think, yeah, we lose sight of that, and we have lost sight of it. Religion, the problem with religion is, of course, that for all the good it can do, devastating things. And I think we've talked about this quite a bit, because it makes people feel so certain of certain things, and that lends itself to a certain arrogance and a certain, we're all control freaks, us humans, right? And when we believe something's right, we want to convince everybody else it's right, and we want them to agree to it, right? That's our nature, and therefore religion is a very, very it is a very dangerous thing. It has powerful consequences. It's one of the most, really, I think, dangerous aspects of human nature, in the sense of what, and it could do amazing good. And I think we can point to lots of things. We've talked about that too, right?
Yeah.
Hospitals and concern for the poor, like so many things in our Western liberal society have their roots in those beliefs. But by the same token, it can turn around and commit genocides,
Right.
and they do horrible things. So it's a two-edged sword, but I agree that we need to expand our horizons as Christian people. So even if we do believe certain things and believe that we're right about those things, that's not to the exclusion of listening to others, right?
Right.
And openness to realizing that we're open to correction, we're open to change,
Right.
which is not something that typically goes well with no matter what it is, whether it's Christian belief or Islamic belief or fundamentalist Jews. They don't want change. They don't want to adjust their beliefs, because they believe they've got the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and it's a closed book. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So I'm going to push back on one of the things you
okay,
said,
yeah,
but then you did come back to where I want to take you, right near the
okay,
end of what you were just saying there. I was going to push back when you said we're all control freaks. We all think that we're right. And I
yeah,
was going to say, I think a lot of people are sheep. They just follow somebody else who says, this is the
true,
truth. I will tell
yeah,
you the truth. And you follow.
yeah,
A lot of theologians will say, this is orthodoxy. And
yeah.
you have to believe this or you are no longer a believer. And then people just follow.
And I think those two things can be true at the same time, right? The thing is that religion gives rise to certain personalities that then take advantage of what you're talking about, take advantage of the fact that many who follow religions follow them relatively blindly for whatever social reason. There's all kinds of reasons, right? And most of it, I think, is social. When you belong to a group that accepts you and loves you, and that you establish yourself in that group, then anything that threatens that group, that belief system, is going to be seen as a threat, right?
Right.
And so it becomes self-reinforcing. And then unfortunately, narcissists and certain charismatic people can really take advantage of that. They can really latch onto that. And that's true in every, like, not just religion, but in any belief, like politics. Look what's happening right now
Oh,
in
please
our,
don't.
seriously. Like,
Yeah.
and that's a belief system as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to the listeners, if you have any thoughts on where I had intended to take that whole miniseries, please send those in. I'd appreciate hearing about that. And who knows, we might do that last episode to tie the knot. But
Interestingly enough, by the way, they just discovered, just like apparently, I think, like very recently, the first Neanderthal massacre. They
really,
found, yeah, they don't know if it was other Neanderthals, or they don't really know who committed the massacre, but a whole mass grave with women, children, men. And I know my first thought was the same as your, probably, okay, well, a mass grave doesn't mean a massacre, but it does, because examining the bones and so on of all these people, they all show actually not only marks of violent death, but actually cannibalism. That they were
well, I
probably
was actually wondering that is this a massacre or is it because of starvation? They had to go through that ice age, that mini ice age. They
it's a
started
good
eating each
point.
other.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you know what? This is the problem with ancient history, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes we miss that too. we're C.S. Lewis talked about this one in one of his books. He said, we're more certain about the very distant past than we are about the recent past. The way they often talk about these different species seems to have a lot of confidence, and the fact is we're going on very scant
Right.
evidence, right? So
Yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah. But I think they found evidence of them being murdered, like of them being hacked to death or something.
Okay.
Not just the cannibalistic stuff, but their skulls being cracked open and stuff like. But again, you could say, well, maybe that was just part of the cannibalistic part of it. So
Right.
you're right. Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
Well, we'll keep our eyes on that and see where that goes. But
yeah,
let's talk about where we're going now, where this
yeah,
podcast is going now. We said at the start of today's episode that there may be a few more episodes trickling out here and there over the next few months. We know that there certainly will be 2 more over the next few weeks, and we'll explain more about that in a few minutes. But as for a full reboot with the season 7, that won't happen until at least January to February when my teaching load at the university eases off. That too, as I said, that has been the norm for this podcast. But at this point, I have to say that we're not sure if the future holds a season 7. I'm speaking for myself, Scott. I don't know if you have a different thought on this.
uh, like I agree. We'll have to have some discussion and see what we want to do.
Um, if we do come back, and I say if only simply because we just don't know if there's going to be another one,
Right.
but if we do, we need to work our way through some questions about rebranding, reformulating the whole podcast. For starters, I wonder if we need to change the name of the podcast, Recovering Evangelicals. We have explained more than once it's an intentional play on words. We are people who are recovering from evangelicalism, and we're also people who are hoping to recover certain aspects of evangelicalism, aspects that have been lost or forgotten or distorted. And I know that's a pretty incredibly arrogant claim for us to make, that the two of us hillbillies here are going to rehabilitate the institution of evangelicalism, setting straight millions of adherents of the evangelical camp. Do you think we can, Scott?
Well, we can throw some thoughts on the pile anyway. But yeah, no, I think the strength of the show is the people we talk to. We really get to interview a lot of really interesting people, and very smart people, and people who have really studied these things, and then just interact with them. And I think that for me is of tremendous value, and I think it is to our listeners. So
Yeah, it's helped me too.
mhm.
I have been saying again and again over the past 5 years or more that I wanted to reclaim that title, evangelicalism, simply because it means good news. And I'm all for good news, especially these days, these
Yeah.
horribly turbulent and disturbing times that we find ourselves in. But what that good news means has changed. A lot of evangelicals think that the good news is that everyone's going to hell. God can't tolerate the humans that he himself created, and he just wants to throw the whole project into an eternally burning lake of fire, except for the small group of us who say that Jesus absorbed all the hatred and anger and punishment. I have a really hard time with that kind of thinking. We've explained in more than one episode that the good news is not, it's not that. It's instead about love and forgiveness and acceptance, getting along.
Yeah. Maybe the issue is the ism part of it. To reject evangelicalism, as an ism, but maybe not evangelical, right? Which, like you said, simply means good news. If you lived in Germany, evangelical, it just means Protestant.
So in other words, Scott, it sounds like you still think that we can resurrect that label evangelical. I'm not so sure myself. I had been trying for years to advance that agenda of rehabilitating the label good news or evangelical, but truth be told, over the past half year, let's just call it that, I think I've given up. Evangelicals, especially American evangelicals, are moving from crazy to insane.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lost cause. And I know this is not true of all evangelicals. I know that. If any listeners getting upset, I know it's not all evangelicals, but the fact is the larger majority of more level-headed members of the evangelical camp have allowed the crazy members to take over and hijack the label.
Yeah.
And so I think the label is irretrievably lost.
Yeah, well, you might be right. And I guess for me, what I typically do is if somebody says to me, well, what are you or whatever, I typically will say, well, I'm a Christian, obviously, and within the general bounds of what that means. evangelical in the sense of what you're saying, the good, but I make sure I distinguish that I'm not one of those. Not what most people think of it as evangelical. And that, so you're right. It may be irretrievable, at least for now. And maybe there'll be a reckoning, and someday, it will come back.
Right. Here's a confession. You just reminded me. This takes me back to when I was only in my 20s or teens or whatever, back in my Pentecostal days. And I hope any friends who know me from back then will understand. But I do remember back in those days, I was evangelical. I was trying to win souls for Jesus. And when I did talk to people from school, for example, at university, I'd be talking to people about my faith, and I would say, you should check out the church, but don't come to my church. There's a church down the road. You can go to that one, but don't come to my church because they're just going to scare you off.
Yeah, right.
I'm not one of those.
Right.
So
holy rollers. Right?
Oh yeah, fun times. Now there's another change for the podcast that I've been mulling over, and it's not just a name change. This is a more serious one. I'm wondering about our target audience, what that should be. For the past 10 or 20 years, which of course includes the 6 seasons of this podcast, I've been exploring a variety of aspects of traditional Christian thinking and letting go of a lot of things that we would now call unnecessary baggage. We've gone down that proverbial slippery slope where one question leads to several others and then more. You take away a few bricks in one part of the edifice, and that leads to collapse of a few others, and eventually whole walls start crumbling down. And what remains of the Christian belief that I hold now, that looks completely different from the one I held 10 or 20 years ago. I've given up a lot of specific theological ideas and embraced a lot of new ones in their place, and maybe we should do an episode on that long list sometime.
Well, yeah, and I think we have covered that to some extent. You talked about what your kind of new understanding is of a number of those things, and I did as well. So, yeah.
Okay. Personally, I think that kind of introspection, that self-examination of the faith system that was handed down to me, and getting rid of the parts of it that just don't work anymore, I think that's a good thing. It's a great thing, a healthy thing. We need to keep re-examining our beliefs in the same way that we reevaluate our politics, our finances, our sociology, our worldview, our core values as we grow up. As we move from being children to being teenagers to young adults, and then old guys like you and me, Scott, will inevitably change our values, our beliefs, the hills that we'll die on, our understanding of what's really important. I was messaging with members of our private Facebook discussion group, asking them about why it seemed that the discussion on Facebook wasn't as lively as it used to be. I've noticed a considerable drop in the engagement on Facebook, even though the number of audio file downloads continues to grow considerably. A few recommended that I needed to develop a new platform. Move away from Facebook. They recommended things like Instagram, Reddit, a long list, Discord, Substack, YouTube, TikTok, and X. And maybe we'll say a few things about those later. But a few of the responses from a few listeners took me to a deeper, more foundational level, got me asking a more fundamental question about the podcast itself. And here's a few of those comments. Robert said, I don't think there's an issue with the vehicle. It's probably just a combination of subject matter and where people are at. We probably go through phases of what interests and challenges us. Since the start of the podcast, Recovering Evangelicals, until now, you and many of us have shifted greatly from where we were to where we are now in terms of faith and religion. Previously, when there was plenty of discussion, it was likely on issues that would directly impact our faith or worldviews, things affecting where the rubber meets the road, if you like. I guess, speaking for myself, this is Robert speaking, and he has in brackets here, others may be traveling a similar path, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. While shifting around a lot from the earlier long-held beliefs and trying to come to grips with the unraveling, it was fresh, new, and a little disorienting, which raises so many more questions, and so the discussion would contain perhaps more questions and more challenges, more discussion. Now, a little further down the road, there is a comfortableness with the unknown and no longer any rigid attachment to the formal beliefs that were held. Now, another longtime listener, Glenn, responded to that thread with this. Why don't you read it, Scott?
Yeah, so Glenn is responding, and he says, pretty well, same thing as what you said. The magical thinking of Christian belief, no matter how you analyze it and validate it or invalidate it with science, for me, it's over. People can be good together and they can be cruel. Meaning is found in the present. And then a third longtime listener, Ruth, responded to that with, quote, "Me as well. I'm not anxiously searching for answers the same way. I'm comfortable where I am now and listen out of interest. It's been a true Plato's Cave experience for me." And if you don't understand what Ruth means about that Plato's Cave experience, you can easily Google it or check out a couple of links that Luke will leave in the show notes to episodes we've done in the past unpacking that particular idea. In a few sentences, it's an amazing story about going on a philosophical journey, discovering truth, realizing what you once believed was only a shadow of the real thing.
So those are three listeners that really got me thinking for a while that, maybe it's our target audience. I need to reconsider that. And in doing that kind of thinking, I realized I felt I was getting caught up in a catch-22 kind of a situation. We and our longtime listeners have been on a long journey, asking and answering some big paradigm-changing questions and getting rid of a lot of baggage along the way. So moving forward into further seasons of episodes, should we continue to do more episodes about each next set of questions we encounter? What other baggage we still need to drop? At the risk of scaring off new listeners who are just beginning their own journey down that slippery slope and might not be ready for the bigger changes we're suggesting from the vantage point of being further down that path. Again, they're only just beginning to work their way through whether we can stop taking the Bible so literally. They're just getting comfortable with an old Earth timeline of millions and billions of years, and whether that whole eternal conscious torment in hell is a man-made concept rather than an ultimate literal truth. And so I find myself having to navigate Sophie's choice. Do I pour my energies into this group or that one? Or do I try a mixture of both, which is kind of like that stage many churches find themselves in when they try to decide, do we go contemporary or traditional? And they say, let's do both. And that so rarely works.
Yeah, true. Well, my inclination might be that we have a whole foundation of episodes for people who are beginning their journey, and maybe point them to those things for those people, but continue kind of the journey for people who've been tracking along with us, or people who may find us and enter in at that point, right? But people can go back and listen to some of those rather than trying to redo them or to, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't intend for us to do this self-promotion, but thank you, Scott. I do want listeners to remember that we do have archives. You can look at our listing.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, the list of episodes chronologically or thematically. And I would say a lot of our episodes are what podcasters tend to call evergreen. They're subjects that haven't changed in hundreds of years. Yeah. What do we do with the whole concept of hell? Where did the Bible come from? Those are things that you can listen to 10 years later and they're still relevant.
Right.
So go through those archives. Oh, and for that matter, there's a third listing, and that's by guest speaker, a list of our guest experts. So
for sure.
So I also am wondering if when there is a season 7, it's going to be a lot more focused around books and authors. We're going to identify books that have been just recently published or books that have been very influential and get the writers and take that approach.
And maybe some of the emerging issues, I think you're going to talk, while
when the news headlines, when there's something relevant.
I mean, what's going on in the world that is connected to, we see, for example, the situation in the Middle East and the incredible influence of this dispensational idea that's had, and it has real world consequences. Like, this is not just theoretical discussions. So,
Scott, you read my mind. You must be looking at the list of ideas I have here.
Sorry,
perfect segue. I love it. So that's exactly. So let's talk about that now. That's exactly the next 2 episodes that we are going to be putting out. Since the podcast has started, I've kept a long and growing list of ideas for potential episodes. And one of the ideas on that long list was to do an episode that looked at Christian nationalism. That's been on my list for at least 2 years, but I kept passing over it for 2 reasons. First, it seemed to me that everyone was doing it at the time, or had done it quite a while ago, and I didn't want our episode to be a Me Too kind of an episode, a copycat or a trend-following kind of a thing. And second, because it just seemed to me to be mostly an American phenomenon. Christian nationalism, to me, I thought was, okay, that's in America. I don't hear much about Christian nationalism here in Canada, and it also doesn't seem to be big in Europe and other parts of the globe. It's Americans, white evangelical Americans to be more specific, who are associated with that idea. and a large fraction of our audience is American. They may well make up the majority of our audience if you go by raw numbers. But in 2025, I've looked back at our statistics, our analytics. In 2025, we've also had listeners from 77 other countries than the USA. So for those two reasons, I never felt we needed to do this for a topic. But a few recent comments from listeners in our private Facebook discussion group really got me thinking, okay, we need to do this. So here's one from Nick. Scott, do you want to read that one too?
Sure. Yeah, so Nick writes, I'm not sure how well this fits with the show broadly, but lately I've been very concerned with dispensational theology and its effects on foreign policy. It does seem like people and politicians who hold this view of theology actively work towards bringing war into the Middle East region in order to accelerate the arrival of the end times. I know we've had episode 107 about this topic, but I wonder if you could perhaps give an update to it given the recent happenings between Israel, Iran, and the United States. And here's another comment from Doug in response to Luke asking what we should do after the Ancient Hominids miniseries. Right now in the USA, we have theocrats trying to set up a theocracy. Hominids just aren't nearly as timely as the fact that a senator said the quiet part out loud. Foreign policy, in his mind, comes from the notion that God will bless us if we support Israel, just like his Sunday school teacher said. Ted Cruz, in case you didn't hear it. Huge swaths of Christians are part of the MAGA cult, having replaced Jesus with Trump. This country is falling apart, and Christians, as they define themselves, are a big part of it. I'd suggest some episodes dealing with Israel and Gaza and Iran, fascism in America, and the religion of Trumpism. And then Cynthia's comment in response to Doug's suggestion. Cynthia says, I'm thinking that there are many who might not even know that it's dispensationalists that are part of this process. To think that what I grew up with, Plymouth Brethren roots, has such a large impact on so many, just seems to be crazy to me. I always saw this as a fringe way of thought that we were moving away from.
So it was comments like these that helped me to see that evangelical dispensationalism is the foundation of distortions like Christian nationalism. And then I realized it doesn't stop there. Christian Zionism, the prosperity gospel, and the end times, that whole left behind rapture and the Antichrist craze that swept the world in the 20th and 21st centuries. Dispensationalism has had a big impact on our society.
Huge impact. I've lived it. And you've lived it too. So yeah. We both can speak through both personal experience and study. You know, I've also studied it pretty intensely over the years. So that's dispensationalism. And the other big stream flowing into the whole Christian nationalist thing is what's known as dominion theology. And that's not the same as dispensationalism, but it's another strong theological trend that is having a big influence. So maybe we can also talk about that at some point, but go ahead.
Okay, so we are going to look at that. We'll first bring in one scholar who will give us a quick 101 on what this thing, dispensationalism, is. I know I myself had never heard that word itself before 10 years ago, even though, as I learned about it, I found out that much of my theology for the past 30 or 40 years, all through my Pentecostal charismatic days, and then much of my more recent Associated Gospel and Baptist days, that was all dispensationalism. Never knew. And then we'll hear from another scholar about how that dispensationalism was behind a lot of the crazy things we see happening in the evangelical world today. Again, it's behind Christian nationalism, American involvement in the Middle East, and then Christian Zionism, and even the prosperity gospel. I had thought we might turn all of that into 5 or more episodes. This is another example of where one idea for an episode leads to 2 or 3, and then 5 or 6. We've seen it happen many times over our 6 seasons. But in this case, I just ran out of time, or maybe I ran out of steam. And so at this point, it will be just these 2 episodes, these 2 experts, and then who knows what will follow after that.
Right, we might pick something up in the new year. You never know.
I don't want to create a formal season ender. This is, in a sense, our ender, but we're not ending. You're going to hear at least 2 more. I want to leave the door open for the occasional episode. As Scott was saying, things will come up. There will be a great book release we want to talk about, or something crazy in the news, the headlines. But it goes without saying that those are unpredictable and sporadic, so you'll need to keep checking. Or really the best thing to do is to subscribe to the podcast so that you'll automatically hear when each new episode comes out. And a side benefit, if we get a sudden increase in subscriptions over the next few months, that'll help us make the decision about doing a full season 7. So stay tuned for our next interview next week, and stay safe.
Yes. We'll see you later.
Bye for now. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.